Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I want to start this video with saying that a lot of things I'm going to be talking about in this video are going to be very hard to listen to, especially if you've gone through a miscarriage or you're trying to conceive after a miscarriage. I just want to put that trigger warning out there that I will be talking about a missed miscarriage that I suffered earlier this year. As of right now, I am pregnant with my rainbow baby. So if you've been following my journey, I don't want you to think that I am going through a miscarriage right now, because I'm not. I am pregnant right now, but I wanted to give you guys the backstory about what went on with my missed miscarriage, since so many people have reached out to me and asked me, what is a missed miscarriage? Like, how does that even happen? So this is my video to explain to you guys everything that happened with my miscarriage. I'm going to try my very best to give you guys all the information without getting too upset. So the beginning of December 2021, I found out that we were pregnant. I still have, I believe, the photos of those pregnancy tests, so I'm going to add them here so you guys can see. My test lines were getting darker every other day. I was taking a test and the lines were getting progressively darker. So in my head, I was a lot less, worried about anything. I assumed everything was going to be good because my lines were getting darker, like everybody always says, right? I took those pregnancy tests, the lines were getting darker. I felt completely normal. I actually started having pregnancy symptoms way earlier than I ever did with my son. Like at 5 weeks, I had really bad nausea. I really felt pregnant very early on. And then around 6 weeks, I was laying in bed getting ready to go to sleep, and I felt like some cramps, like very mild, like period cramps, nothing like super crazy, but I felt like a little bit of cramping, which cramping can be very normal in pregnancy, but it also can be concerning in pregnancy. I had felt cramping with my son, so I wasn't concerned about this particular cramping. But the next morning when I woke up, okay, I want to say before I actually say what I'm about to say, this is a very TMI video. So don't watch this video if you're not prepared to hear some things that are very TMI, okay? Forewarning, very TMI video. But the morning when I woke up and I went to the bathroom and I wiped, on the tissue there was a little bit, like a very tiny bit of like bright red blood. There was nothing on my underwear, nothing in the toilet. It was just that little bit of blood on the tissue. And I started asking around some of the other moms that I know if they had experienced something like this before. And a lot of people were like, it's normal, like I bled, and like as long as you're not continuing to bleeding, as long as you're not still having cramps. That's kind of what everyone was saying to me. I had an appointment set up with my regular doctor because I needed to see my regular doctor before I could see an OB. So I was waiting to go to that appointment before I could go see an OB about what was going on. But I had no more cramping after that. I didn't have any more bright red blood, but every once in a while when I would wipe, I would get a tiny bit of brown discharge, but it was very, very light. I didn't have anything dark, or I didn't have any actual bleeding. Now it took until I was 9 weeks before I could see my regular doctor. And when I explained to my regular doctor what had happened, she was pretty upset with me for not going into the emergency room, because she said, this is a really scary thing. You should have gone to the emergency room. And maybe some of you will feel the same way, that I should have gone to the emergency room. I should have went and just like gotten seen. But at this point, I knew no matter if you go to an emergency room, you go to an OB, if something is wrong with your baby when you're 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks along, there's nothing they can do to prevent whatever is happening and stop whatever is happening. So I had faith that everything was going to be okay with my baby, and I didn't want to put myself at risk because it's 2021, and you know what's going on in 2021 if you've lived through 2021. I didn't want to put myself at risk of going to an emergency room and maybe getting sick and bringing that home to my 1-year-old that I had at that time, and maybe getting the whole family sick. I didn't want to risk something like that when I am not physically showing signs like I'm in an active miscarriage. To me, that just sounded like I would be putting myself and my family at more of a risk by doing that than waiting to get my appointment to see my OB. But since my doctor was very worried, I guess you could say, she was very worried. She wanted me to go get an ultrasound right away and then have an emergency appointment with an OB. So thankfully, because she felt that way, she made the right phone calls to my insurance, to my OB's office, to the ultrasound clinic, and made sure they made a priority of getting me seen. After 2 days from when I saw my PCM, I had my ultrasound for the very first ultrasound, and I believe that would have been around 9 weeks and a few days. I don't remember the exact days, but I wasn't 10 weeks yet. And when I had that ultrasound done, the ultrasound tech was saying, okay, well, if you're 9 weeks, we should be able to see everything over the belly with a normal ultrasound. And she did the normal ultrasound, and she was like, I can see the baby, but it's really hard. It's like maybe too low. Like, she was giving me a lot of like things for maybe why she couldn't see the baby very well, and asked, like, can we do a transvaginal ultrasound instead? Which, if you don't know what that is, it means the ultrasound is like a stick and they put it inside you, right? We ended up with doing the transvaginal ultrasound, and she could see the baby just fine. And she told me that my baby was measuring 6 weeks and 5 days, and she couldn't find a heartbeat at that moment. And there was a lot of her trying to make me feel like everything was okay. Like, well, technically babies don't always show a actual heartbeat at this early on. Like, sometimes it takes all the way till 7 weeks until you see a heartbeat, and everything could be okay. We just could be a few days too early. But I knew, because we were actively trying to conceive, I knew exactly when we conceived, and I knew exactly how far along I was, and I knew that I was 2 to 3 weeks behind what I thought. And there's just no way that I'm 2 to 3 weeks off when we got pregnant. And I'm explaining this to her, and she said, well, don't get too upset. Don't think that this means your baby isn't viable when you don't know for sure. She was like trying to make me feel like everything was still okay, which I appreciate that she was like trying to comfort me in that whole situation. But if you've been somebody like me, if you are somebody who has been actively trying to conceive for a very long time, years, right? You are very aware of when you got pregnant, when you were trying. You're an early tester, so you were testing very early. I think I took my first test at 10 DPO. So I knew there's no way I had a positive pregnancy test on, December 13th. I think it's when I had my first positive pregnancy test. There's no way I was positive then, and then I'm showing 6 weeks, 5 days pregnant. After I had this appointment with the ultrasound tech, and it was just at like an ultrasound clinic, like an imaging clinic, I did call the OB's office that I had my referral to, and I explained to them like what had happened with like my primary care doctor and then now this imaging clinic. And they just asked me to make sure that I sent all the documents over to their clinic, and then they were able to get me in a few days later. Like I think that they wanted to wait almost like a week from when I had that original ultrasound to get a new ultrasound, because they wanted to see if there was any changes in my ultrasound and what was going on, what was measuring. So it was like less than a week later I went to the actual OB's office. It's the same OB that I'm being seen at right now for this pregnancy. But she was very, very nice. She took all of the information I had for her. So I told her, like, you know, we're tracking. This is when I think I conceived. This is when my period started. This is when I had my first positive pregnancy test. And I was giving her all this information. And even she was like, even if you're off a little bit, she was like, you should definitely be at least 9 weeks pregnant, and your baby should be measuring 9 weeks, not 6 weeks. And she was even thinking I could have been further, like I could have been more like 11 weeks at that point. She was like, you know, based on your last period, which I don't have regular periods, but she was thinking I could be even further than what I thought. And she wanted me to have another ultrasound right there and then to see, is it accurate? Was that other ultrasound accurate? Does it look different for her? That ultrasound basically looked exactly the same as the first ultrasound I had. I think they were like 3 or 4 days apart. I think I was like 10 weeks exactly that day, based on when I think I got pregnant when I had that ultrasound. And at that ultrasound, she said, you know, your baby's measuring almost 7 weeks. So I'm sure very similar measurements. She said that she compared the ultrasound that they took to the ultrasound I had a few days ago, and she said there's been no changes at all. Sorry, I'm like struggling to get this out. The hardest part is that she told me, you know, your baby looks perfect for how old it should be, right? Like your baby is the way it should be. There's just no heartbeat and there's no growth, there's no change. And that there should be, even if it's only a few days, like at that point, the baby should show that it has grown more. And that based on when I was getting positive pregnancy tests, I should be a lot further along. And I explained to her, like I said, everything, and like when I had that cramping and when I first had the bleeding. And she thinks basically that at that point, that night that I had the cramping, is the time that I lost my baby. Okay, I'm sorry guys. If you've ever been pregnant and you lost a baby, and then you get pregnant again, you're really happy to be pregnant. It's just hard because no matter what, no new baby can ever replace the baby you lost. All right, so I'm like a mess over here, so I'm just gonna try to like go on to the next part of the story, because if I keep trying to explain what I'm thinking, I'm gonna keep having a meltdown. So after the whole conversation me and my OB had, basically explaining what she could see, what her thought process was, the information I had, what I knew, my OB was concerned. She said, you know, if you did lose your baby back when you were having those cramps, this means that you've probably been pregnant for at least 3, if not 5 weeks post losing your baby. So she's thinking, you know, you could be anywhere from 10 to 11 weeks based on my last menstrual cycle. And if you stay pregnant once you've lost a baby, but it's staying inside you, it increases your risks of having, you know, infections and affecting your fertility in the future. And it's not good to just hold on to a baby. that's not developing anymore. And I wasn't having any more bleeding. I wasn't cramping. There was nothing that was indicating that my body was doing what it needed to do to miscarry on my own. Me and my OB talked about my prior history, and if you watched my labor and delivery story with my son, I hemorrhaged with my son when I was giving birth, and I almost died, which is a very scary situation. So it's something I brought up to her, and I told her that, I'm worried with miscarrying. I don't know like how it's all gonna work, and I had hemorrhage with my son. She basically told me that her preferred method that I go forward was to have a D&C in the hospital where I could be monitored, and that she didn't want to give me anything to have a miscarriage at home because she just didn't know, first of all, if my body would take it, because I was not responding to any of my natural body's things, basically to tell me that I should have been miscarrying. And then because there's no way for me to monitor how much blood I'm losing myself when I'm at home, and that there's a higher risk to something, happening when you're not being monitored. So I did have a suction D&C, which is when they go inside you and they pull your baby out. Which now, looking back on it, sometimes I wonder, was that the right decision for me to do? But when you're going through a really traumatic experience, it's really hard for you to grasp all the things and what's the best decision for you to make. It's hard to know, am I making the best decision? But I've come to terms with what's happened and the decision that I made, and I'm not as concerned about the fact that I had the D&C now as maybe I was when I first had it. I've done a lot more research now, and people say that D&Cs can be dangerous. Basically, it can cause all of these conditions. They can hurt your fertility. They can cause a lot of other problems. But I had a suction D&C. I did not have a D&C where they scrape you. So even though my doctor is well, you should be 10, 11 weeks, but since your baby is only measuring more 6 to 7 weeks, that they should be able to do everything by suction without having to physically remove anything from your uterus. Which after the procedure, I discussed it with her, and she said that it was a very easy procedure and there was no scraping of my uterus involved, thankfully. So that's made me a lot less concerned. I don't know if I would do the same thing again in the future if this ever happened again. But I do understand how going through a loss and not knowing what to do or how to handle it, how it could really affect your decision-making process. So if you know somebody who's going through a miscarriage and there is a similar type of situation where they're being told hey, you have to do something about it, please be easy on them, because it's not an easy situation. I decided against doing any of the genetic testing, and that decision was also made with my OB, because she essentially told me, the chances are that it was a genetic issue because your baby just stopped growing on its own. Nothing looked like it was contributed to any outside factors. Nothing looked like it was the sac, I can't remember what it's called, the sac that holds the baby in it, was completely formed, right? So there was nothing to show any type of trauma to that baby that would have indicated that something outside of genetics would have caused the miscarriage. And since my body wasn't naturally releasing it, her explanation to me wasn't I didn't have the right things to hold the baby, because my body was holding the baby. Some people miscarry because they don't have the right progesterone levels, or there's something going on with them, so the body releases the baby. And she pretty much was like, that doesn't look like the case for you. It looks like it was definitely something genetic. And she said we could take the baby and test it for genetics and see if there's something wrong genetically, but sorry, this sounds really like bad in the way I'm gonna explain it, but should because the baby is so small at this point in pregnancy, that they're gonna be getting a lot of extra tissue from my uterus coming out with the baby, and they are obviously going to do their best and everything to make sure they're testing the right things. But if any of my tissue is getting mixed in with the baby's tissue and anything that they're testing, since the baby is being sucked out of me, it's not just coming out on its own perfect, right? That there's a chance that my genetics could get mixed in with the baby's genetics, and that it could give me a false reading on if it's a genetic issue or if it's not. And she said it's not 100% accurate when they're doing something when it's this early along that you're having a miscarriage. It's a lot harder to tell what caused the miscarriage. So it's a really tough thing because everyone wants answers, right? Like, I would love to know what happened, and I'm sure a lot of people around me who care about me want to know what happened, but sometimes there's just not the answers there. So I literally cannot stop just breaking down in tears during this video. I thought I'd be a lot better during this video because it's been a little while, right? But I'm not. It's not easier. I'm sure it will get easier. But I think I'm done talking about this now. If you've made it this far and you've dealt with all the crying, I apologize that I'm a mess. But thank you for listening to my story, and I hope that this next journey is better. And I'm very grateful to be pregnant with my rainbow baby.